Hi everyone. Nice to be here talking. As Crystal said, I work for an organization with a very, very long name. Part of the reason it has such a long name is this is a name chosen through committee amongst 3 different constituencies of people: researchers, development practitioners, and membership-based organizations of workers in the informal economy themselves. And I think, as you know, whenever something is chosen through committee, there's many different wordings and iterations, and this is the name we have as a consequence. We go for short, and I will spend a bit of time talking about this organization because it has an interesting structure, and I think we are trying to do some interesting things. I'm also based at Rhodes University, and part of our mandate has been, we were founded in 1991, and a big push for us actually came out of India. So the Self-Employed Women's Association is a trade union in India that has existed since the early 1970s, of about 2 million self-employed women working in the informal economy. They realized that if there was going to be a movement, that there needed to be a movement of informal workers globally, right? And that SEWA itself was not going to be able to catalyze this outside of India. It needed support from the rest of the world. So it allied with a bunch of academics from Harvard University, as well as development practitioners, UN people working in the ILO and other agencies. And together, WeGo was founded as a project of the Harvard Kennedy School. And it since has grown into an organization of its own. We're registered as a charity in Manchester. But SEWA are our founding members. They chair our board, and a lot of the way we work is based on the SEWA model. We are governed by a board, which is chaired always by a worker constituency member, and the worker constituency on the board is the majority. Every 4 years, we have a General Assembly where our work plans are approved by the membership, are considered and approved by the membership. So everything that we do, all of our work has to run through the membership. So that is, we're quite different from a sort of standard non-profit organization in that way, in that we are membership-based. Over the last 25 years that we've been in existence, 25-ish years, we have worked hard to build up international networks of workers in the informal economy. And I think yesterday Ruth made a really good point in the morning discussion about, well, let's talk about what workers are actually doing to organize and counteract some of these negative forces that we are talking about through the kind of analysis of labor markets. And I think that is a really important point because otherwise we tend to lose hope and get a bit depressed. Well, I do anyway. But working on the other side of things, building the collective action against these very powerful forces, I think is an important place for us to keep our focus. And really, blood, sweat, and tears has gone into the building of at least 3 global networks of workers in the informal economy working particularly in highly feminized sectors where women are disproportionately represented. So we have the International Domestic Workers Federation, which was incubated within the IUF with WeGo support. Now has 590,000 members worldwide, fairly evenly distributed across regions. StreetNet International, the network of street vendors and market traders, 621,000 members, mostly very strong in Africa, strongest in Africa. HomeNet International was launched last year off the back of some very strong organizations, HomeNet South Asia and HomeNet Southeast Asia. So strongest in Asia, but we do have now affiliates in Africa and Latin America, 600,000 members. So these are the movements of women who are organizing and doing the hard work of pushing back against some of these strong forces of capital and reorganization of production and neoliberalism, and that we need to recognize as well. The third organization, Global Rec, is focused on waste pickers, on informal reclaimers. They are strongest in India and Latin America, but we'll be launching the global network this year as well. All of this has been aided by a huge grant from the Ford Foundation over the next 5 years, Solidarity Fund grant, which has been awarded to WeGo, but which will mainly go to these networks to build up their own capacity to serve workers in these sectors. So the logic behind WeGo is that basically the rules of the game are stacked against workers in the informal economy, and particularly women, right? Because you not only have the capitalist rules of the game, you have the gendered rules of the game, and we know that that's part of the structural story. And the only way to change the rules of the game is to organize, to develop forms of collective action, and to ally with groups and individuals who can magnify that power, right? So a single informal worker on her own is not going to be able to change a lot, but 2 million informal workers coming together can change things. These workers who are not easy to organize as well, right? It's not like you're all in a formal workplace and things, you know, are coherent. But also the fact that you need researchers and you need people sitting at the ILO or in powerful organizations that can help to amplify the voice of workers in the informal economy. And that is our main job as WeGo, is to try and allow organizations of informal workers themselves to access these policy spaces. So I do not go into a policy space and occupy it for myself. I will go in to create an entrance for organizations of informal workers themselves to represent themselves. I also do a lot of work helping to build the capacity of those organizations to be able to represent themselves effectively in those spaces, because just being in the space is often not enough, right? You've actually got to know how to speak the language, you've got to know the statistics, you've got to have the data if you're going to make any kind of impact. So I just wanted to give you that overview, because I think that in itself is an interesting thing. The second issue is really about, and this links to the theories of social reproduction that we were hearing about from Alessandro on day one. The first battle for women working in the informal economy, and this comes from Marty Chen, who was one of the co-founders of WeGo and who has worked closely with Sewa for many years. The first battle for women working in the informal economy has been to have their paid work recognized as work. And this is the kind of founding principle of WeGo, and it was also the founding principle of Sewa. And in the early days, this kind of set us against a type of feminist economics, which was kind of focused on having unpaid work recognized as work in the sphere of social reproduction, right? The argument of Sewa was that, you know, women's waged work is generally recognized as work, perhaps not in spheres like domestic work. But in the global north, women working in waged employment, even if it's bad employment, that's still recognized as work. The struggle for the street vendor, the waste picker, the home-based worker stitching garments in her own home, and even the domestic worker taking up paid care work, is that this hasn't been seen as work, right? So the first battle has not been to have your unpaid care work recognized. It's been to have your paid work recognized as work. You know, there's often an understanding that the informal economy exists outside of regulation, out of state regulation, but that's not true. A street vendor sits very much within state regulation, but it's within urban regulation. And a street trade is usually governed by, in South Africa, it's governed by traffic departments. There's no workers' rights in that. Street vendors are seen as a nuisance, right? So you're not recognizing this work as work. And it caused this, you know, for many years, I think there was, you know, this is always our niche. We have to get that kind of work recognized as paid work before we go into any sort of the sphere of social reproduction and unpaid work and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm saying this quite honestly because it's a huge tension within our organization right now, you know. Things have changed. You know, another pushback was against, because many of the workers we are working with are not casualized labor, right? They're not formally waged workers who became self-employed or were let, you know, or had their labor rights taken away but are still effectively in a disguised employment relationship. They've been self-employed workers they've always been self-employed workers. If we think of the structure of economies in West Africa, for example, women have a long history of market trade as self-employed workers, right? So it's not the same process. It's not a process of the casualization and the downgrading of labor rights. This is employment which was never recognized as employment, quite frankly. It is the reality in many parts of the world. It always has been the reality. It's not like there's been a downgrading of labor rights process that's going on here. And I suppose I want to differentiate the people I'm talking about now from those processes Alessandra was talking about yesterday, which is very much about downgrading of labor rights and so on. You know, this is disguising waged employment and that kind of thing. And there was a pushback against the idea that everything has to be framed in this way of, you know, the downgrading of labor rights, when these people have never had anything like that in the first place, right? And so that also set WeGo against some of the sort of discourses that were coming out. I think things have shifted. I mean, we've heard more about how feminist economics has shifted more towards the Nancy Fraser type stuff. We get a sight of women in the sphere of production as well, even women who are not in the formal economy, because often, you know, where there has been a focus on women in the sort of sphere of production, it's tended to focus on waged workers in the formal economy. There's not been enough of this thing of women as self-employed in the informal economy. I think that's shifted. I mean, we saw Alessandra presenting yesterday very much on these issues. I think as well, WeGo came under pressure to work with domestic workers. So to include our first three sectors were always home-based workers, street vendors and waste pickers as feminized and vulnerable sectors of the informal economy. But we came under pressure to work with domestic workers as the most feminized sort of labor force in the world. So we had to start rethinking how we took on social reproduction. I mean, you know, these are women doing paid care work. And I think, you know, we've also come under pressure to recognize the intersection of unpaid care work and women's paid work. So we now have, you know, a big project on provision of childcare for women working in the informal economy, and particularly urban informal economies. So I do feel like while we started out being very clear that we were going to focus on self-employment of women in the sphere of production, you know, things have shifted on both ends to bring us closer to sort of considering the sphere of reproduction and how that intersects with the work we do. It still creates a lot of tension in our organization. Any shift away from a sole focus on women as self-employed workers tends to cause issues. But I think, you know, as time goes on, we will resolve this. Right. So I thought I would just give a few, an overview of some of the basics around the informal economy, just for some conceptual clarity. I understand I'm giving one perspective, and you know, there's always other perspectives, and we can chat about these. I'll give this overview, and then we can have a time for maybe some comments and questions. So why is the informal economy important? Well, the informal economy is important because it takes up 60% of workers. I mean, we heard from Alessandra yesterday, I think that 60% of workers in the world are employed in the informal economy, and they lack protection, right? They lack social protections and they lack labor protections. So if almost 2/3 of your workers are working in something, that should be reason enough itself, right? To focus on something. But because we work very much in the development sphere and in the development world, the question is, what is this doing about poverty? And I think, you know, again, one of the big critiques when WeGo started was that there was this focus on economic growth, and then it would just trickle down, right? We all know that argument. But one of the key ways in which growth can actually trickle down is through the creation of decent work, right? That is how you can start to distribute the fruits of economic growth. And that focus on jobs was not there in some of the major development discourses, right? So WeGo's argument was that, I mean, many people's arguments was that there needed to be a bigger focus on jobs within economic growth in order to distribute more fairly the benefits of economic growth. But then WeGo's argument was like, you can't just look at standard formal employment, you have to look at what exists, you know, in the economy, at the bottom of the economy as well. where people are working under very poor conditions, low earnings, and high costs and risks, right? So an informal worker, despite the fact that they're earning less, has probably got higher costs in terms of having to pay for water and sanitation, having to try and source electricity, having to find someone to look after their kid, all those kinds of things. And so it just means that these people who are working are not able to work themselves out of poverty, right? So you can be working 16 hours a day, but you're not going to be working yourself out of poverty. And of course, if anything goes wrong, and this is where social protection is so important, and I know on Friday there's going to be a lot of discussion on that, you've got nothing to catch you, right? There's no sick leave, there's no medical aid, there's no, insurance, medical insurance to pay your salary, and everything falls apart. You have to borrow money, you go into debt, and then once you're paying high interest debt, things get more and more expensive. And that is the reality for many of the people working, in these kinds of jobs. For many years as well, there was an idea that we just have to eradicate the informal economy. And I mean the kind of self-employed street vendor, waste picker type work. This is not decent work, it just needs to be eradicated. And it kind of intersected with a lot of the modernization discourses we heard from Zodzi on day one as well, that the path to a flourishing economy is through industrialized male labor, and a lot of the economic models kind of fed into that. As you develop, your informal economy will disappear, and everything will be wonderful. I mean, what we've seen is that actually with economic growth, the informal economy doesn't necessarily disappear, right? It can actually increase. Like, let's look at India, which has had record economic growth over the last how many years. It's still got an informal economy of 80 to 90%, depending on which measurement indicators you're using. So there's no automatic, sort of path away from that. Without policy interventions. And I think it's quite a hard line to take, because you don't want to glamorize the kinds of working conditions of people working in the informal economy, particularly at the survivalist end of the informal economy. It's hard, it's dirty, it's precarious. You're taking on a lot of costs. It's very, very difficult. But at the same time, that's what exists for many people, and they've done a huge amount of work to create these kinds of jobs for themselves, and you want to recognize that as well. So how do you do that? Well, perhaps you do that by creating more enabling conditions for these kinds of people to earn more, to improve their incomes. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means as we go on. So it's an idea of, do we eradicate, or do we work with the grain and try and support people in what they've created for themselves in many ways? And certainly in places like West Africa, where you have these thriving sort of entrepreneurial, self-employed economies, I mean, you couldn't do anything else but recognize this as an important source of employment and economic sort of contribution to economic life. So it's kind of this debate about working with the grain or against it. And for many years, there was this feeling of we must work against it. And I would say that more recently it has changed. There's a greater recognition that we do actually have to, you can't just eradicate these jobs. All jobs are important right now. And you have to try and find ways to support these workers to improve working conditions, to improve incomes, and that kind of thing. I think there's still some work to do around connecting in the enabling policy environment that we talk about for improving conditions in the informal economy and what that means for like structural economic transformation. Ruth, I'm looking at you. I think there's some theoretical work to do there that I don't think we as WeGo have got to yet. And I think maybe is something we still need to think about, but maybe also for you guys to think about. So the idea is that we have to address the root causes of the low incomes and high costs faced by workers in the informal economy. And the way to do that is through policy, but also giving a voice to informal workers themselves to be able to talk about what they actually need. And we'll talk a bit about the lack of access workers have to spaces to do that. So the informal economy, what is it? You may have heard A lot of people talking about informal workers, informal jobs, the informal sector, the informal economy. Like, there's just a lot going on, right? So what is the informal economy? So the informal economy, and this is the ILO definition. So 20 years ago, the biggest job for WIGO was to help develop internationally recognized definitions. And these are statistical definitions, and they're not the only ones. But I think it is important that we know that there are some definitions, because often you can go into a policy discussion with any government in the world, and they'll go, oh yeah, the first thing we need to do is just define the informal economy. And that's almost a way of just moving the discussion away from, like, what are we actually going to do for the informal economy? So it is important to know that some definitions do exist. And I know Statistics South Africa draws on these definitions in their measurement of informal employment in South Africa. So the informal economy is informal enterprises, which are unregistered enterprises. Often they could be just one-person enterprises, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Plus informal jobs. And informal jobs can exist both within informal enterprises, and they can exist within formal enterprises, right? So somebody raised that question about what is informal employment in the formal sector. That happens a lot in South Africa, right, with the casualized labor. You could be working for Volkswagen, which is a formal enterprise, but you don't have any labor rights and you don't have any social protection, and you're on like a day-to-day sort of thing. Then you're informal, waged employed in the formal sector, okay? But if you are working for your auntie at the spaza shop, in an unregistered spaza shop, then you're a worker in the informal sector. Okay, so that's just the difference. So informal enterprises plus informal jobs plus the products thereof plus for your own final use, so this also incorporates subsistence, equals the informal economy. So the informal economy is the jobs, the enterprises, and everything they produce that has market value. Okay, so again, that's probably another point for debate, what has market value, but that is the definition used by the International Labour Organization. In 2021, and I know somebody's research project is very interesting, looking at unobserved economies and contributions to GDP. The IMF has tried to do an estimate of the contribution of the informal economy to GDP, and has so far come out with 35% of GDP in low and middle income countries. So it's significant, right? That's a good third of the GDP of low and middle income countries. Again, making the point that it can't just be ignored, that it has to be dealt with. I know that there are critiques of these IMF, the way the IMF has done these estimations. And I know that the ILO and our statistical team at WIGO are going to be working on how to use direct methods of data from national surveys to improve upon these estimates of contribution to GDP. But that's quite new work that will be going on in the next 5 years. And who are the informal workers? Again, quite good to have clarity on this. Sorry, this is a bit small. So they're workers not covered by labor or social protections through work, okay? So that's an important thing. If you are covered by a universal health, like we have free access to healthcare in South Africa, right? So that you could think that's a social protection. But you're not getting it through your employment relationship, okay? So if you don't, in South Africa, for example, if you're not registered for the unemployment insurance fund, you're an informal worker, okay? So the definition is social protection through work, not just any social protection, not just because you get the child support grant. It's got to be through work. So, and we have informal workers, waged workers in the formal sector, so the VW example I gave, or plantation worker working for a plantation, and I think these are maybe some of the workers we were talking about a lot yesterday morning, these are formal firms, but labor is being downgraded without protection. And then we have in the informal sector, which are the unregistered enterprises, the spaza shops or the street traders or the person doing some recycling by the side of the road. Those are all unregistered enterprises. We have several categories of worker. So we have employers who tend to be the best off in the chain, and they employ other people, right? They have sufficient resources to employ other people. And this is dominated by men, employers generally. But then we have what are called own account workers. So these are self-employed, do not employ others. They work for their own account. So this is the lady selling sweets on the side of the road. She's an own account worker. Then we have regular or casual employees. So they're usually working for the employers. This is a very strong issue in Asia in particular, where you have, so yesterday we were looking at women working within the factories, within these global supply chains. But there's another group, right, who get subcontracted by these factories to work from their own home, right? So that's another level of subcontracting that happens. And often women choose this because it's easier for them to take care of their kids, it's easier for them to look after the house, but it does mean they're taking all the risks and costs of production onto themselves. They've got to find the electricity, they've often got to find, all of the kinds of things that go in. The factory is moving them out of the factory and into the woman's own home, right? So then she becomes personally responsible for that. And I'll talk a bit more about a change in category that's happened recently around something called a dependent contractor. And then there are the contributing family workers. So this is a huge category of women's employment in Africa. I think about 22% of women's informal employment in Africa is in contributing family work. So you're basically just supporting the family. You're not necessarily being paid anything, but you're there supporting your family enterprise or whatever. And that also gets classified as informal work. And then something that I think people often get confused about is that domestic workers are not actually in the informal sector, right? Domestic workers are in households, are informal workers in households. And that's a different category. In South Africa, domestic workers can be formal or informal. So by law, domestic workers, you should be paying UIF, unemployment insurance, for your domestic worker. But because there's such high non-compliance with that, actually the majority of informal workers in South Africa are informal workers. And for most domestic workers around the world, that is the case. Okay, some more basics. What drives informality? That's always a big question. Yesterday and for the last 2 days, we've had a very much a feminist political economy approach to what's going on with informalization in global supply chains and so on. This kind of type of analysis of the informal economy is very much what would fit under what we call structuralist theories of why the informal economy exists, right? There are global structures of capitalism, but also of patriarchal capitalism, which drive the growth of informal economies because it benefits more powerful actors. They profit more. If they can drive down the costs of labor by not providing protections, by not providing services, they make more money. And I think that was very much the gist of the presentations yesterday, that the informal economy is a result of these macroeconomic structures that are leading to the downgrading of labor rights. It's not in anybody's interests to take on employees. Let's just call them self-employed, and then we don't have to be responsible for much. So that's the structuralist sort of theory of what drives informality, which does tend to be ignored by certain powerful development actors. The World Bank, the IMF, for example, don't particularly like this explanation of why informality exists, and will do their best to try and ignore it. But it is very much a reality, and I think in countries like South Africa is one of the main explanations. Basically, the macroeconomic structure is not putting enough investment into creating decent formal jobs. So what people are left with is informality, and that's what they do. But it's not the only explanation that exists, and I think it's important to know that there are other theories of what drives informality, because the reality of the situation is that it's a little bit of everything. It's not just the sort of macroeconomic structure. And if we're really going to sort of think about how do we improve the situation for these people, we've got to know some of the other drivers as well. And certainly, under the structuralist theories, the kind of gendered structure of society is very much an element there, right? Women's work is not really recognized as real work. And that's a huge one that women informal workers face. In the 1970s in Ahmedabad, where SEWA was formed, and this is an old story, but I think it's quite illustrative. What happened was, Ilabat, who was the founder of SEWA, there was a big layoff in the textile mills in Ahmedabad, which is like, it's a textile center, was a textile center. All the men lost their jobs in the textile mills. And so what happened? The women started taking up piece bits of work. They started selling stuff on the side of the road. They started stitching in their homes. They started doing a bit of domestic work here and there. And Ilabat, who was a member of the Ghanaian Textile Labour Association at that point, was like, right, I really think we need to organize these women. This is work. Let's get them into the union. And she was told, no, this is not real work. This is not real work. We will not organize these women. Because it's not happening in a factory. It's happening on their homes. It's happening on the side of a road. It's not going to happen. And so she left the Textile Labour Association and formed the Self-Employed Women's Association as a way to say, well, actually this is work and we are going to organize. And the reason they're a union in India is because there is a loophole in the trade union laws. Usually trade unions can only be for people in waged work. In India, there is a loophole in the law. It's not usually, it differs by country. But I think in South Africa, you cannot have a trade union of self-employed. To become an official trade union in India, you can have self-employed workers, and that is how they manage. They are one of the central trade unions now in India. The dualist theory is another sort of theoretical position, and this was, I think, in South Africa embodied by our ex-president Thabo Mbeki, talking about the two economies of South Africa. There was the first economy and the second economy. He talked about it, and the second economy is very much the informal economy. And then there was the first economy, which is the kind of modern mainstream economy, the one everybody pays attention to. The dualist theories kind of say, well, they're two streams of the economy. They don't have a lot to do with each other. They're just on completely different trajectories. And they also understand the informal economy as a shock absorber, right? So when there is crisis, the informal economy absorbs the jobs that are lost in the formal economy. People can, that's the role of the informal economy, is to absorb the shock. I think there are a couple of problems with that. First of all, the informal economy is structurally very linked to the informal economy. Both economies are actually tied into each other. We've just finished some research on the SRD grant and impact on traders with the Centre for Social Development and in Africa. And I mean, what was so clear was that, the way, even with traders who got the SRD grant, were using that money to go and buy their stock from formal businesses to sell on the side of the road, right? So to say that these two economies are completely delinked is incorrect. And actually, I know there have been some attempts to kind of value how much the informal economy actually contributes to the formal economy in South Africa through these kinds of backwards linkages into the formal sector. I worked for a very long time in central Durban in Warwick Junction with traders there, and they are intimately linked into the formal businesses around them. Whether they're buying meat they're buying their bovine heads to cook on the side of the road, they'll buy them from the formal butchery in the Warwick Junction area. So they are connected. And if you want to understand what's happening in the informal economy, you need to look at what's happening in the formal economy, right? They're not delinked. Secondly, the informal economy is a shock absorber. It certainly can be. So, but I mean, in COVID, we didn't see that happening, right? Actually, most jobs I think we looked at national data in South Africa and Peru. Most of the jobs that were being lost were informal jobs. So this idea that the informal economy is just this endless shock absorber that can just take people is incorrect. And I think South Africa is also a very interesting point, very different again from West Africa, in that our informal economy is tiny. It's 33% of employment compared to like 85% of employment. And it's mainly waged, it's mainly this kind of waged labor in households or waged labor in the formal sector that makes up most of it. And that's because there are huge barriers to accessing the informal economy. It's not just a seamless transition that you can make from the formal sector, from the formal economy into the informal economy. So I would say there are many problems with the dualist theory, but again, important to understand and to be able to analyze when people talk in those terms. And then there are the voluntarist theories, and this really is where the international financial institutions have a field day, which is that people choose to be informal, right? So actually, this is a choice. It's not necessarily about regulations being inappropriate. It's just that people are tax avoiders by nature. So, they'll just choose to exit from the formal economy because it means they don't have to pay social security contributions, and it means they don't have to pay taxes, they don't have to comply with the state. And so, the kind of logical sort of argument that comes out of that is that we must eradicate sort of state regulation of various forms so that people choose to be formal. But then you'd have to ask, well, what does formality really mean? So those are the sort of four broad areas of thought, and they encapsulate a lot of different theories. I mean, I think more and more the IFIs have tended towards the legalist and voluntarist theories, whereas you would still have, say, the International Labour Organization pushing structuralist theories. And certainly the reality is, and we'll talk a bit now about the heterogeneity of the informal economy. Some of these are true for different groups of workers as well, right? It's not like one of them is true for all the workers out there, and it's important to recognize that. So, again, just going into some of the key characteristics, I've just mentioned heterogeneity. There is a real tendency in the world to just talk about the informal economy or the informal sector as it's just one huge blob that can all be dealt with in the same way. And I think I was talking about self-employment and waged employment as being actually two very different features of the informal economy, right? And how you deal with those in policy terms has to be different. You can't just be saying, I'm going to have an informal economy policy and it's going to look like this. Like, what is actually going to be in that is going to have to differ for different workers. And some of the sort of key differentiating factors within the informal economy is status and employment. So that is your relationship to the kind of economic structures around you. Are you in a waged employment relationship, which is where you have, well, okay, no, I won't go into that, but the main ones are you in a waged employment relationship, or are you self-employed? Those put you in very different positions in relation to the economic structures around you, right? If you're wage employed, they may not be legally your employer, and there may be disguised employment, but there is somebody who can be identified as having some kind of economic power over you, or who you are reliant on to access economic inputs or for your economic opportunities. If you are self-employed, it's much more difficult to identify that, right? What is a street vendor? Who economically are they related to? It's much more about their backwards and forwards linkages into the formal economy. Are they able to negotiate their backwards linkage to the formal firms to be able to buy their stock on more preferable terms, for example? What are their relationship to their customers? I often see these cell phone vendors selling cell phone things, and I'm like, wouldn't it be great if we could get cell phone companies to provide like protections to street vendors, because these people are doing their distribution work for free, right? So it's not just about employment, it's about where's your position in the chain of distribution, where's your position in the chain of production, the chain of supply. We have to think about different economic relationships when we look at the self-employed. Same with the waste pickers. Quite often they're selling on and up recycling chains, so it's a supply chain issue for them. What responsibility do these big recycling houses who actually make so much profit off these people doing the work on the ground, what responsibility do they have? So again, it makes us, if we're going to take seriously the idea of self-employment, we also have to look outside of just this employer kind of thing as the only economic relationship that is important. There's other economic relationships that are important. Place of work is also really important because it determines the regulatory environment in which you operate, right? If you are a domestic worker, you're working in a private household, right? So there's all sorts of difficulties about how you regulate private households from a labor law perspective. If you are a street vendor, it is the side of the road, and you may be subject to the traffic department, who is going to see you as a nuisance, not as a worker making an economic contribution. If you are a waste picker, again, it's the municipality, but it's probably the environment and sanitation part of the municipality who's actually going to have control over your conditions of work, right? So again, this point is that informal workers are not necessarily outside of regulation. They're often within regulation, but it's not labor regulation, and it's not protective regulation, which is like one of the most important problems. And then, of course, there's occupation or sector. So domestic work, street trade, waste picking, you know, this also plays a role in what it is you're actually doing, where you are located, what your status in employment is. Yes, and this one.
Does the study of the informal economy take into consideration of the global economic landscape? Because one of the things I kept asking myself when I was doing my research was that, okay, these people are working in the gig economy, but also you find in companies, they're also trying to survive in a tough economic climate. So I asked myself, wouldn't it be a bit unfair to expect them to support informal workers, to provide a lot more support for informal workers? Because if they do have to provide support for more informal workers, then they would have to let go of some of the people in their formal.
Are you sure they do? What are their profits like? Have you examined their profits?
Yeah, it's one of the things I asked myself, and is that something that's considered in the study of the informal economy?
Of course. I mean, I think, you know, I'm not advocating that we should make sure that all firms, you know, provide protection. Well, I am a bit, but like I could see arguments against that as well. I just think, you know, I think we have to think carefully about what corporations can't afford, quite frankly, and what corporates can't afford. Yes, there are certainly small businesses that cannot afford, for sure, especially with load shedding and all of that going on. But I would ask big questions about like cell phone companies in South Africa and whether they don't have enough money to sort of provide more protections. I mean, we've heard about how much money is being channeled to so few these days. This is one of the key mechanisms of how that happens. It's because, you know, big corporates and stuff are not taking responsibility for their workers or anybody in their chains of production, supply, distribution, or anything. So, you know, I think we'd have to ask hard questions about whether these companies really don't have enough money to do that. So, heterogeneity. We have all of these different types of informal workers. Policy needs to be differentiated, right? That's the key message around heterogeneity. The other really important factor, and I mean this linked into the discussions yesterday, and I'm going to show you the same triangle that Ale showed you yesterday, is that the informal economy, like the informal employment, like formal employment, exhibits strong gender segmentation, right? So that means that women tend to be concentrated in the most vulnerable forms of informal work with the highest risks and costs and the lowest earnings. And on average, and I think we've tested this in several countries, including Ghana and South Africa, using national data sets, you have the same earnings gap. For the same type of work, women will earn 75% of what men earn, right? And I think 2 years ago we did this with the South African data. So this is the triangle of segmentation, and you'll see, I know Alejandra showed you this yesterday. Employers at the top, predominantly men, and unpaid family workers at the bottom of the triangle, predominantly women, and then you get a bit of a mix in the middle, and it's kind of dependent on context. And obviously, as you move down the triangle, earnings are lower, and they get higher as you go to the top. And I think this is also where it's important about the structural the drivers of informality, right? It's going to be different for different groups within this triangle, right? The employers may well be tax evaders. In fact, I know that there are informal sector workers who are informal enterprises who are tax evaders. They just are. They pay people and they have people working for them. They're not complying with minimum wage. They're not registering their workers for UIF. They have enough money to do so. They are evading their responsibilities, and they do exist. The problem is those people make up 3% of the global informal economy, right? 3%. So we get an inordinate amount of attention on, like, let's get the tax evaders, when that's 3% of the global informal economy. Much, much more people, and particularly women, are located in other forms of informal employment where tax evasion isn't even on the radar. In fact, they're getting taxed so heavily, they're getting taxed more heavily than the formal workers are. Right? So I think it's important that we recognize that there are different drivers for different sectors of the population, and that the further down we go, the more structural those drivers are likely to be, and the less choice there is in the matter of what is being, of evading regulation and responsibility. And then I think this, here's some data. This is ILO data made slightly easier. So composition of informal employment in Africa, we have sub-Saharan Africa, Southern Africa, and the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. The reason we separate out Southern Africa, and this is also important, not all informal economies are the same. There's an academic from the London School of Economics who works on this, Kate Maher, a very interesting paper, saying you cannot say that the Southern African informal economy, which are economies dominated by waged employment and settler colonial economies, you cannot say that they're the same as West African informal economies, which were never settler colonies. They never had as much wage labor in the first place. You've got to understand that these are different types of informal economies. And that, again, that's another sort of thing we have to think about in terms of policy. Like, you are never going to eradicate self-employment in Ghana. I'm sorry, you just aren't, right? Are you? No. So, better that you think about what kind of policies in place that we can actually support these self-employed women. You'll actually see this. So for sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, you'll see that employees are sort of 28%, whereas for Southern Africa, 70% of informal workers are employees, right? So that already shows you the different structure of employment in different parts of Africa. We can't even see Africa as one sort of unified conglomerate of informal economies. If you look at own account work, and let's just look at sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, you'll see it's quite even between men and women, right? 52% and 52% of men and women's employment is in own account work. But if you look at the contributing family workers, look at that big difference there. 25% of women's informal employment is in contributing family work, 12% of men's, right? So that's where you start seeing the gendered structure of the informal, the gender segmentation at play. And you'll also see it in the employers. So 2% in total, but men are 2% and women are 1%. Not a huge difference, but it also shows you how few people in the African informal economy are actually employers, right? It's not a huge number. You've got much more people located in the more vulnerable forms of employment, own account and contributing family worker. So it's just important to point out those differences as well, and also to understand that different parts of Africa have different informal economies. There's a lot the South African government could learn from West Africa. I know West Africa is also not ideal in terms of how it treats its informal economies, but there are still lessons that I think South Africa could learn from a place like Ghana in how you work with self-employed workers, because they just have to in places like that. It's just so much a part, whereas in South Africa it's a minority of people working as self-employed traders and so on. So what drives gender segmentation? And again, I think this was covered, quite a lot in Ali's presentations yesterday, and a lot of structural issues, social norms. In Asia, for example, it's very hard for women to leave the house, so they'll take on a lot of employment in the house. Husbands won't allow them to leave the house. That's the kind of sphere in which they have to exist. So any kind of paid work needs to be done within the confines of the house, and that's usually informal work. Unequal bargaining power. Women, may find it more difficult to bargain effectively with the other economic forces in their lives, which drives down incomes and types of work that they're doing. Legal barriers, as well as violence, right? The types of harassment that you see from local government officials onto street traders, women will always be more vulnerable to that, right? The worst story that I encountered when working in Durban was a bunch of women cooking bovine heads, for commuters to eat on their way from work. And a local government official, a bunch of women, local government official man came up to them and said, I need to collect your trading permits, all paid up, business license and everything. I need to collect your trading permits, give them to me. I need to go and verify them. And they believed him and gave him their permits. And he then took the permits and called the Metro Police in immediately to go and do a permit check on these women. And they lost everything because they didn't have their permits with them. So all of their pots and pans were confiscated. All of their food was confiscated, and you never get that back from the police, right? Once it goes, it's gone. So now you sit with all of your inputs gone. When is this guy? It's that kind of harassment and level. It's violence, and it's I said, why do you think this guy did that? And they were like, he doesn't like women. He doesn't like women being successful, because the bovine head cooks in that area are relatively successful. They earn quite well compared to other informal workers. And this can just be done, right? I mean, that story it's just stuck in my head for so long, because now these people have to go into debt. They haven't made any money. They're reliant on their daily income. And it's many women are employed in self-employment. So if we are serious about thinking about, well, how do we change the models to think about the reality of women's work in the global south, there is something we have to do about conceptually understanding what self-employment means for the economic models we have to work with. And I think that's important. Because if we have a Keynesian theory and we stimulate the economy and it does this and it does this for workers, but we're assuming waged workers, what does it do for the self-employed? We've got no one thinking about that. And I mean, that's a challenge as well, I think. And maybe it's WeGo's job and I'm trying to push it, but perhaps the young feminist economists might also be interested in taking it up. But just to say that, social reproduction and the linkages into the informal economy are just as severe. We heard a lot about how working women, the she session during COVID, and a lot of it had to do with having to take care of children or elderly people or sick people. We ran a survey during COVID in 11 cities around the world, and this is aggregated data from these 11 cities. And this was taken from 2020, where we looked at June earnings so if we say COVID started in March 2020 and all the shutdowns happened in March, April, we then looked at earnings of informal sector workers in June as a percentage of their pre-COVID earnings, right? And so what you'll see is orange meant that they didn't experience any care increases, right? We have women on the left and men on the right. And we divided it into direct and indirect care, which I think makes this a bit more complicated in any case. But you'll see that if we just looked at direct care, let's forget about indirect, which is the second set on each side. You'll see that women who reported an increase in direct care responsibilities, their income in June was only 42% of their income before COVID, right? For those women who did not report a increase in direct care, their income was 63% of what they had earned before COVID. Okay, so they were earning almost 20% more. Okay, they still weren't at 100%, but they were earning almost 20% more than the women who were reporting the direct care increase. What's interesting is that for men, you don't see the same thing. Men are on the far right. So for men who said that they had reported an increase in direct care responsibilities, they were earning almost 62% of what they had earned pre-COVID. And those who had no care increase were also earning just over 62%. So it's quite interesting, right, about the level of care and the impact on incomes that we see from this data. And it's quite unusual to have this kind of data, this kind of quantitative data actually showing the impact of unpaid care work on paid care work on self-employed women in the informal economy. The majority of this data will look at women in waged employment, and it mainly comes from the global north. So it is nice to have this data, and I've put in a link to the paper there. A few words on some important topics. It's very common to hear the term the informal economy is unproductive, and so therefore we should get rid of the informal economy. This is only true depending on the type of productivity you're talking about. And I am not an expert on productivity, so if anybody is, please come in and help me here. But as I understand it, there are multiple forms of productivity. Labor productivity, capital productivity, material productivity, and there's something called total factor productivity, which is about the ratio between what is inputted into the business and what actually comes out in terms of outputs. And apparently, on people who've done studies of informal enterprises, the informal economy is not too bad compared to the formal sector on total factor productivity. So if somebody says to you, or if you come into a space where someone's like, oh, the informal economy is unproductive, you're like, what form of productivity are you talking about? Because let's be precise here, because there's different types of productivity, and informal workers measure up differently on different scales. But I think it's also really important that quite often that discourse fails to recognize the structural, infrastructural, and technological barriers for these workers to be more productive. So that many women are struggling with the unpaid care work, for example, which certainly reduces their ability to be productive. If you are a waste picker who's got your child on the back and you're competing for the most valuable waste at a dump site with young men who have no children on their back, who's going to get the most valuable waste? It's going to be the men, right? Okay, so we also need to point those things out. So what about you guys provide some childcare, and then let's see if these women get more productive. Or infrastructural. Well, it's no wonder you're unproductive if you are a garment worker in in an informal settlement where there's no electricity. Let's provide electricity. So, that's infrastructural. And, I think we can think of all sorts of examples where these people working in the informal economy are disadvantaged in a way that that more bigger firms are not. And so, this is perhaps the link to the structural sort of transformation, is that if you want these businesses to grow, if you want them to get to the point where they could be employing other people in decent conditions, how about we lower some of these structural, infrastructural, technological barriers to them being able to do that? And let's stop individualizing responsibility for social reproduction at the same time. So that's a word on productivity. A word on formalization. So again, a common question, how do we formalize the informal economy? I think, first of all, it's going to differ according to different types of workers in the informal economy. How you formalize an employer is going to be different from how you formalize an own account worker, right? Secondly, what type of formalization do we want? Very often governments, and this happens in Africa quite regularly, the formalization that is envisaged is technocratic, top-down, no consultation, totally focused on taxation. Let's tax these guys because they're not paying.